This session is about the reality and rhetoric, rhetoric and reality, and the broader picture there. It's always a challenge for me to follow in any way Peter Shergold, because Peter's unbridled and infectious enthusiasm is so invigorating, and I come along and say, yeah, but is that exactly how it's going to go? And I don't want to sound negative on all of that. It's how do you ensure that we can express some cautions or issues that need to be worked through from experience and reality without actually dampening the drive for reform. And in a sense, I'm hoping that this session will give a bit of both, where we can go in driving reform, but a bit of, what's the reality around it? So we've got three great speakers. Helen Dickinson, who's from the University of Melbourne, and previously in the UK from the Universities of Manchester and Birmingham. And in Melbourne, she's the Associate Professor in Public Governance. But she can bring to us a broader picture of the movement away from just new public management to where we've been heading in this broader field of wider connected government. Then we've got David Gilchrist. I won't introduce him again because he's been introduced last night and again this morning, but an interesting role he's had both within government and with the not-for-profit sector. Tessa Boyd-Kane is the Deputy CEO at ACOS, but she's also a recipient of the inaugural 2013 Fulbright Professional Scholarship for Non-Profit Leadership. And in that, she's been looking at, in her case, some of the US experience in philanthropy and the other ways in which to improve the capacity of non-government sector and how it can work with government. So that will be an interesting subject. And then we'll have, after that, some comments from Meredith Edwards. Meredith is Emeritus Professor of Governance at the University of Canberra. She led the Institute of Governance for a long time at the university there, including during the period that it was part of ANZOG's activities. But she was also a Deputy Secretary in Prime Minister and Cabinet before that. So she's got a strong interest in the issue of governance, the way in which government works with academics, works with the community, works with NGOs, business and so on, and how that has been operating. So a great panel and discussion. So we might start off now with Helen Dickinson. Helen.
As Andrew mentioned, what I'm going to talk about is this implied shift that we've seen from new public management through to new public governance, and think about whether the implications of that are, have we seen a new public service arise out of that or not? So I'll start from what I hope is a relatively uncontroversial position, which is this idea that over the past 25 or 30 years or so, we've seen increasing amounts of scrutiny on terms of governments and their activities, and a sense that performance is really important. What we need to do is we need to drive better performance. That's because we've got a series of things that face our communities that mean that we're going to have to do things in very different ways. We've got new technologies, rising consumer expectations, but also potentially fewer resources to do that with. So there's this definite pressure to do more with less. In the literature, when you look at that, one of the ways that it is suggested you can do some of that is through the reform of governance, and we've certainly seen this as a trend over the last 30 years or so. So after the formation of many big kind of welfare states post-World War II, what we saw were the large kind of hierarchical organisations that Peter mentioned earlier. The late 1970s, 1980s, there was a critique of these forms, too big, inflexible, they don't deliver what we need to do and they're very inefficient. And so what we saw was the introduction of some sort of market mechanisms to change the way that government works and to incentivise things in different sorts of ways. However, again, you get to the mid-1990s and these mechanisms have their own unintended consequences, and what we see is a broader interest in notions of networked governance across a much more disaggregated picture around public services. And so when you look in some of the academic texts, what you tend to see is this suggestion that we've shifted in modes of governance, and we've shifted through different kind of paradigms around managing public services. And so this is a table that's just based on some work that Stephen Osborne did in setting out this idea of new public governance. And he suggests very much that, we've moved through this time where we were just interested in kind of rational public choice type theories into a context where we need to think about networks and we need to think about inter-organisational relationships, and those as being fundamental to government. And sometimes when you read the academic literature, it suggests we've slipped through these different modes of governance in a relatively kind of successive way, each replacing the former. Whereas the reality, I guess, that we all know is what we have in practice often is more of a hybrid. So rather than creating an entirely different new public service, what we have is the overlaying of these different sorts of mechanisms on top of one another, and sometimes they produce helpful outcomes, and sometimes less sort of helpful. So one of the analogies that I often think about in demonstrating some of this is the idea of a palimpsest. So any of you who have kind of read any literature around ancient Greece or anything like that will be familiar with the idea of the palimpsest. But essentially in a context where it was very expensive to produce paper and writing materials, what you found people did was they wrote on an item, and then when that had sort of outlived its usefulness, they either washed off or rubbed off the text off that source. And they overlaid it then with more writing. And so, like in this picture here, what you find is you've got at least 3 or 4 different kind of versions of writing over that. And what you find is sometimes that produces kind of really interesting effects as those bits of text come together. And sometimes it's really unhelpful and you can't read what's there at all. And I guess what we have today is this kind of palimpsest or overlay of different sorts of modes of governance. So I started out life as a geographer, and the notion of a palimpsest is quite important in thinking about landscapes in geography in similar sorts of ways. And what it suggests is if you look at a picture like this, you can't automatically see what has formed these sorts of landscapes, because often it's successive different waves of impacts. But if you look at different sorts of points, you can work out some of the different iterations that have gone on over time. And sometimes that produces really amazing and impressive kind of spectacles, and sometimes it produces kind of rather unhelpful effects as well. So in terms of operating in that world, what does this mean? In Rod Rhodes and Mark Beaver's sort of latest work around governance, they talk about ideas of decentered governance, and essentially this idea that actually in governance theory we've probably focused a bit too much on structure over time and those formal sorts of elements. And what we've tended to ignore is the personal agency of actors and the ability of people to operate within those systems. So in a research sense, much of the focus in these latest iterations is thinking about, well, where are the beliefs and ideas of individuals, and when they come together, what sorts of dilemmas do they create, what political struggles come out, what sort of games are played around this. In terms of a practical sense, though, I think there are 3 lessons I'd like to talk about what you can do in terms of operating in a hybrid system. And I guess the first one is this idea around, the idea, and Peter alluded to this quite a lot, but this idea that certainty and stability, those sorts of days have gone, if they ever existed in the first place. I think sometimes we have a remarkable ability to kind of romanticise the past and talk about things as being set and kind of working in a good way, when actually the reality at the time often seemed somewhat different. But the example I guess I'm thinking about here particularly is in Victoria at the moment, there's quite a bit of debate about the relationship between the community sector and government, with some in the community sector feeling that relationships are changing significantly and very quickly, and that the sector might be losing the position that it once had. And so people talk about this as being a big sort of new change that's happening, although the reality is that the existence of the community sector, the private sector, the state has always been shifting. It always moves. It moves over time in relation to what's happening in terms of our society. So picking up my geographical analogies again, we can think of that like tectonic plates, I guess, in some senses. So we all exist on these. They're all moving all of the time, but we don't necessarily notice that because they don't move very quickly often. If you're at some of the intersections of it, you might notice it a bit more than others because you'll have more profound effects, even if there are any small sorts of shifts. But when we see a significant shift in terms of tectonic plates, what happens are a variety of kind of physical effects and a kind of a time of upheaval that you get with an earthquake, for example. And I guess this is what a number of people in that sector are feeling at the moment, is this kind of time of great upheaval as the rules of the game seem to be shifting quite quickly. So the second lesson then is, well, if we can't guarantee that things are going to stay the same and that we're not focusing on structures, then what does become important? And in that context, this issue of values and purpose is absolutely crucial. So do we understand the sorts of values and value that we want to create through public services? When we think about organisations who are involved in the delivery of that, are they clear about their contribution that they want to make, about their mission, about the reason for being there? And many of you will be familiar with the Power to Persuade site, which hosts a series of really interesting conversations about this sort of issue. And we've got Gemma Carey here with us today, who leads that site. And there's a seminar coming up in a couple of weeks again, which will pick up on some of these issues around value and values. So the final thing I just want to talk about before I lose my voice entirely is about this issue of skills and capabilities of public servants. So last year, Helen Sullivan and I did some research looking into the future of the public service workforce. And later today, you'll hear from Catherine Needham, who's at the University of Birmingham, and who did a piece of UK work that sat alongside our Australian investigation. And I guess one of the things that we found through this is we're kind of asking public servants to do very different sorts of things, and yet we're recruiting them, developing them, performance managing them, in very traditional sorts of ways. And then we're quite surprised that they don't do the sorts of things that we've heard about from Peter in terms of agility and so on. So I think there's a real need to think carefully about the sorts of skills and capabilities that we need within our system to be able to feed this new sorts of future and to be able to effectively operate in this context of hybridity. And so if you're interested in this work, there's a report about this on the School of Government website, and we also have a blog that brings together the two pieces of work from the UK and Australia, in which we explore kind of innovative and interesting ways that people have attempted to plug these sorts of skills gaps. So having set out those three lessons that I think are important, I think I will stop there and hand back to our chair.
Given that I've only got 10 minutes and I don't seem to have the public suasion that Peter had in just taking the time he wanted, but I'll talk to him about that at lunch when he's back. I want to cover essentially, I guess, three main points. One is to introduce the paper, or rather the experiment, if you like, that was conducted in Western Australia, and give you some ideas about the background of what I'm actually talking about. The second is to talk about the evaluation, which is the fundamental part of the research that we undertook in the Curtin Not-for-Profit initiative to look at this experiment. And then the third element that I want to talk about is, if you like, some points that I think are really needing raising in this environment. It's a good place to do it, but to some extent are, if you like, ultra vires to the central theme of the paper that has been presented today. But in 2011 in Western Australia, we had a change of state government where that government, as one of the first things it did, was to undertake the almost inevitable these days audit of public expenditure and activity. That audit was a very, very broad and deep examination of pretty much everything government was involved in the state, and of course, per force, had a significant amount to say about the not-for-profit government relationship and the kinds of services that government and not-for-profit were undertaking together in Western Australia. The outcome of that audit committee process as far as not-for-profits were concerned in Western Australia, or rather what we have come to call the funded sector in Western Australia. So that part of the not-for-profit sector that is actually in receipt of government funding to undertake the implementation of government policy or provide services on behalf of government. There were three essential things that came out of that set of recommendations. The first was the establishment of a partnership forum in Western Australia, which, as Peter talked about a little bit in his presentation, and which I alluded to in introducing Peter, was really focused on having the major players of the not-for-profit sector and the government bureaucracy, so not political heads but bureaucratic heads, in the same room to be able to then work towards affecting what were the, if you like, the other major recommendations in relation to that audit committee report. The first recommendation was, and I'm very much paraphrasing and simplifying, but the first recommendation was around the need for government to step out of service delivery and for not-for-profit organisations to do more in terms of service delivery, so to be able to take up that slack, if you like. And there were two bases for that. The first basis was that, and the report was frank and I think considered, but that could be done cheaper through the not-for-profit sector channel, if you like. And then secondly, because it would allow for a better partnership and a better focus on who does what, if you like, in terms of the policy and the practice side of community development in Western Australia. The second element related to the need for those services to be provided in an environment or within a policy framework of individualised funding and person-centred care. And of course that's not really new in the Australian context either. However, it does drive from the very top levels, and I think it's fair to say the Premier has a very, very close and continuing interest in this forum and what it achieves. And so that second element of individualised funding and person-centred care is also very, very germane to the overall direction of not-for-profit funding in Western Australia. The third element that I think was important, and certainly one that the government then subsequently backed up with a considerable inflow of resources into the sector, was that services need to be provided by the not-for-profit sector to citizens, but those services need to be provided at a sustainable price. And because of the block funding methodology, the funding in advance methodology, I think it was very fair to say that a number of organisations providing services in the West Australian context, and I know they do more broadly in Australia as well, were, if you like, technically insolvent in a sense, but of course could rely on the capital fund, the funding, the working capital that's injected on a 3-monthly basis to be able to roll forward and to continue providing services. So that was the fundamental framework, if you like, with those recommendations being the essence of a development plan that was put in place by the Partnership Forum. And as I say, the Partnership Forum was made up of, and continues to be made up of, essentially Directors General and senior people from within the funded sector in Western Australia. The purpose of our study, so the Curtin study in relation to that, has been that we were appointed to undertake an annual evaluation of the outcomes from that report and those subsequent recommendations on an annual basis, as I say, for 5 years. So this paper that I've put together for this seminar is looking at the first 3 years of results in the context of that evaluation, but only the results on the not-for-profit side of the fence. So frankly, the word count gets very big when we start to look at the government side of the fence as well, and that's why I want to talk about some of the elements that are considered probably ultra vires to that paper. But in essence, the paper demonstrates, I think, and the evaluation demonstrates that there has been a very difficult path in terms of both establishing the Partnership Forum and managing it, but also more importantly, understanding the sustainability and the outcomes management targets associated with the plans that have been put in place to grow the funded sector in Western Australia. In essence, I think it's fair to say that smaller medium organisations feel considerably under threat, and their sustainability is perhaps questionable going forward because of the changes that are occurring in the way funding is provided, and particularly in terms of outcomes management. I'll come back to outcomes management and reporting in a second, but also because the West Australian economy has also changed quite considerably over the last few years. And anyone that watches particularly the mining sector, one of the things that happens in Western Australia, as I'm sure everyone's aware, is that we have booms, and in those boom periods we tend to spend a lot of money, and then we have bust periods and we run out of money, and we don't have, if you like, a sovereign wealth fund to be able to then generate the economic outcomes that much less support the social development that we think we need to support. And so that sustainability, as I say, particularly in smaller organisations, seems to be a significant risk, just simply because I think of the size, the overhead infrastructure, and also the complexity of the changing environment. So the area that I do a lot of work in under the NDIS, of course, is a very incredibly huge change environment. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of challenges for organisations. Smaller organisations are really struggling to meet that challenge. And I think it's fair to say that one of the things that the recommendations that we made in our report this year, so 3 years down, starting to get a sense of the trajectory, was that we feel that there is inevitably structural change occurring within the funded sector in Western Australia, and one of the things that we think the Partnership Forum should do is actually step up and start to work out what the sector should look like, because we all know that even though there's a preponderance towards larger, in many cases from an economic perspective, in fact we don't want larger, because there's a whole lot of reasons for why smaller and medium organisations are extremely important, not least of which because if you get into rural or regional or even remote service delivery or specialist service delivery, then you have to have the specialist skills and capacity to deliver. But I think the other aspect of that is that the Partnership Forum, according to our recommendation, should really now be sitting back and looking at what the sector should look like and what plans can be put in place by the forum to be able to drive the sector structurally to be able to do two things. One, to make sure there aren't people falling through the cracks, to make sure there aren't things lost. But number two, to also ensure a soft landing in relation to those organisations that may not be here in 5 years' time. That in fact we have a process in place to be able to ensure a sensible retreat from service delivery for those organisations that are indeed needing to retreat from service delivery, and a sensible and sustainable and, if you like, a certain level of surety for those people who are receiving services when those services are transferred to other providers. So there's a seamless, logical implementation process, if you like, that I think the Partnership Forum is probably the key group of people to be able to develop and devise and implement that kind of thing. The other things that I just wanted to touch on, and I'm not sure how much time I've got left, Andrew.
Got about a minute.
A minute, okay. And I once again say I can't do what Peter said, so a minute doesn't equal 4. There's a couple of things that I do want to touch on. The first is outcomes. Well, I haven't mentioned a lot about outcomes in the paper. However, there are still and remain significant challenges in terms of identifying what an outcome is in an organisation, identifying how to measure that outcome, and then how to report on that outcome is a continuing challenge for not-for-profit organisations. On the other side of the fence, if you like, which is not really the kind of language we want to be using at this seminar, but it is equally difficult for government to talk in terms of outcomes, to talk in terms of what an outcome looks like, and then how do we want those outcomes reported to us as major stakeholders in this arrangement as well. So I think that's the first thing that was really important. I think the second thing that's really important is the extent to which the Partnership Forum can maintain itself as a true partnership, in other words, to have endurance in that partnership process and not have the camps retreat to their respective corners in what has been a pretty comfortable dichotomy in Western Australia for 30 or 40 years. And I think that is probably the central challenge. While I'm suggesting, and the paper suggests, that we need to really see the Partnership Forum developing plans and pictures of what they think should be established in time to come, really the Partnership Forum itself and the state of what I would term true partnership is a major challenge for those people around the table, but also for the broader sector and the broader government. And I think that's a really important element as well. So the endurance, not just the idea of the brainchild and setting it up and letting it go, but the endurance so that that is a effective forum in time to come. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to questions in a minute.
So what I want to begin with and lead up throughout my presentation today is this set of principles that ACOS uses to frame our thinking about civil society. We've had a long-standing interest in civil society, but over the past year have really refined our interest along these principles as a way of establishing and supporting what we see as the value and the contribution that civil society makes to democratic process, and then thinking about the role of the community sector. And in the ACOS context, that's particularly community services working in social services to that broader element of civil society. So, of course, non-profits play a major role in the contribution of civil society, but they're not the only part of civil society. There's many parts of civil society that are not institutional in their framing, and there are whole other parts of the community sector and the non-profit sector, ranging across sporting, cultural and arts organisations, that make an equally important contribution. But for community service non-profits, particularly in a social welfare state like Australia, it is really important to recognise the interaction with government in the work that these non-profits do. And as we've heard today, that interaction, those relationships take many forms. But the policy and the funding settings are really significant drivers for community service non-profits. We know that the foundation of the social safety net in Australia is very highly regarded. ACOS has recently commissioned some work by Ipsos, which we published alongside our Inequality in Australia report, which showed how much Australians value the sense that there is a social safety net for anyone who will need it, but also the concern that that social safety net is being eroded. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, the sense that there isn't really strong leadership within the country today to help us face those challenges and to take that forward. And while I think it's easy to see that as a critique of government, there's a critical role for civil society in answering that call as well. The value that non-profits contribute to for the government funding that they receive has been incredibly well documented, not just by non-profits ourselves, but by a whole lot of the economic institutions that we rely on. So most recently, the Ian Harper-led National Competition Policy Review talked about the need for a diversity of service providers in the human services or community service space, the importance of the integration of those services right across complex needs, and particularly recognise the important contribution that community and volunteer services play within a broader context. And of course, again, for our purposes today, we need to remember that non-government is not just not-for-profit, that there is clearly a strong and a growing role played by for-profits, and that raises questions and challenges for us in our discussion today about what is cross-sector and how do we collaborate well in that space. And even earlier, the Productivity Commission talked about the wider benefits of community services in terms of their collaboration, their joint production, and the sustainability of service delivery by non-profits who see their contribution to communities lasting beyond particular funding cycles and often beyond particular policy settings as they work to support people and communities. It was unfortunate, I think, that the Productivity Commission framed those benefits as spillovers, because in our work we see them as the innate value of community services, and one of the things that distinguishes the not-for-profit contribution within civil society to the contribution that others might make in human services. And again, I think if we think about that contribution around for-profits, that's an important point to explore. Undoubtedly, there are some examples of how the relationship between government and community organisations, community non-profits, have really supported and aided the benefits that I've just outlined. We talk a lot about the Partners in Recovery program as one example, a health-funded program that saw the capacity for collaboration between community-based organisations, doctors and other professionals in the mental health space as really critical to try and support complex and chronic needs over time. We're about to see that program rolled into the NDIS, and we really hope that we will maintain some of that really important capacity, which often is not funded or supported in terms of policy and funding settings. And similarly, many in the sector talk about communities for children as a similar example of really supporting and recognising and valuing the capacity for good coordination and collaboration across community organisations. By the same token, there are a whole range of examples of how government processes around policy and funding in the human services space have really undermined the capacity and the effectiveness of collaboration with non-profits. We are incredibly concerned about the impact of competitive tendering rounds and the initial funding cut through which those competitive tendering rounds have been implemented over the past 2 years, seeing $1.8 billion ripped out of community services, and in the course of the funding rounds that have followed, seeing a real fracturing of relationships, a real undermining of collaboration in the sector, and a reduction in transparency, not just for not-for-profits, but most importantly for the communities that they serve. We've also seen a real challenge to effective policy processes and consultation with the risk-averse and I think the quite cautious approach around engagement with stakeholders. And again, that's a challenge for us well beyond funding processes in terms of how we see and support a strong contribution by civil society to the decision-making of the nation. And I think that echoes Peter's earlier point this morning that as much as it's easy to pinpoint things like funding processes, it's actually the relationships and the culture of those relationships that drives the best collaboration. So even as we strive for collaboration, we need to recognise that there are different interests and often different desired outcomes as part of the way that we identify how we can best work together. So with that framing of some of the issues that I think are really relevant to the context of civil society in Australia today and its collaborative relationship with government, I want to look now to a couple of examples from my work on the Fulbright last year in the US. These are quite different examples, but I think they give us some good pointers towards what we might think about. So the work that I was doing was looking at how charities and non-profits, particularly philanthropists, engage in public trust and confidence, how they tell the story about what they do and why it matters. The starting point for that in the US is the data around that is gathered by regulators. So from the national tax body, the IRS, through to state-based charity regulators, all charities are required to report a phenomenal amount of information in return for very significant tax benefits. Now, those charity regulators do varying degrees with levels of analysis with the reports that they receive, but the one thing they all do is publish them. So every report by every charity is published and is available online. And from that baseline of data, not-for-profits in the US have developed and really led an agenda around the research, the analysis and the dissemination of information about the sector. So in leading that agenda, they've had to work very closely with regulators, but with whole arms of government that are involved in similar enterprises, that are involved in social services, that are working in the communities that not-for-profits are themselves. But in leading that process around what do the data tell them about what they do, they've really, I think, brought a very different level of engagement to the process of collaboration across sector. One of the challenges I think we face in the non-profit sector in Australia is the reticence to expose ourselves to that similar level of challenge. We're legitimately concerned about the overhead myth, the assumption that if we report transparently our operating costs and our expenditure, we will be charged about how we will be subject to challenge around how we spend our money and whether it's really reaching the ground, rather than arming ourselves with a really strong argument about how important effective, well-developed organisations are for the work they do in community. We also see really strong concern coming from the non-profit sector about league tables and the likelihood of those if we make the data that is already available more accessible. And I think it's time for the non-profit sector to recognise that we're in a digital age. It's not technology that drives disruption. Technology is the vehicle. It's data that drives disruption. And the data about charities, through the new national regulator and through a whole lot of other sources, is now available. Charities and non-profits in Australia can lead the conversation about what we do and why it matters, but if we're not part of it, it's going to happen anyway. And I think if we pick up that capacity to lead an agenda by the non-profit sector around our own data, that gives us another really critical lever for our relationship with government, and that is to seek greater accountability and greater transparency from government about the data and the information that it holds around community health and wellbeing, and how best we use those data collectively to work towards progress that will benefit us all. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. We have three very different papers before us. But I do see a common thread, and I see it about the respective roles of the public and not-for-profit, if not other sectors, under conditions of uncertainty and change, where no one actor or sector on its own can solve complex problems that we face. So the first paper from Helen, I thought, provided an eminently sensible overview, big picture, in particular looking at the mismatch between the rhetoric, especially in the more academic literature, about horizontal relationships and the reality in a much more mixed framework, suggesting that now and into the future we'll have more layers of different reform processes rather than wholesale changes in organisational arrangements. In fact, unfortunately, there is evidence that in the public sector, at least in Australia, we've made some backward moves, and they need to be taken into account in any mixed modes framework. There's evidence that some agencies have become more and not less hierarchical, with stronger executive control, and public servants more and not less risk averse in dealings with outside organisations, and with middle management claiming less rather than more autonomy in the ways that they're working. So unless there's considerable change taking place beyond the incremental into the future, it follows that there will be a widening of the gap or greater mismatch between the public sector institutions, tools and behaviours on the one hand, and the policy problems that are meant to be solved on the other. I won't go into all the wonderful work that Helen, her centre, has done on what this means for the skills and capabilities of public servants. I just want to add the emphasis that she gives to relational skills and capabilities. Into the future, we will need to be more organised around relationships so that public servants will be acting with others rather than just doing to or for them. And Jeff Mulgan calls this a relational state, and that to me is a vision. The Western Australian government is to be commended, as we heard from David, for the transparency that it's shown in an all too rare series of longitudinal evaluations. So David has told us about that. I think one innovative area to watch is what happens within that partnership forum as they face difficult issues and together try to achieve a shared vision. David's paper points out an interesting fact, I thought, that there's inconsistency across agencies in dealing with the not-for-profit sector, which suggests that crossing boundaries internally, just agency, is a challenge that probably is as great, if not more, than crossing the challenge working across with the not-for-profit sector. We do tend to forget that we work too much in silos internally, so that is stopping us getting on well externally. The evaluation did raise several questions for me about the broader framework of principles on which the relationship will be based into the future, and perhaps that will come out of the partnership forum, and I've got a couple of suggestions what might be within that framework. Tessa's paper seems to be a considered reflection on how to gain more sharing of power and collaborative arrangements between the public and not-for-profit sectors and with civil society more broadly. Importantly, she considers the value of collaboration across sectors and with citizens in the development of policy before the stage of delivery. And I think the lack of willingness by governments to share the decision-making with other sectors and with citizens, I think that reflects what I call a decision-making deficit. The first part of Tessa's paper deals with 5 principles, as you have heard, and she talks in particular, I think, about the importance of, in that context and into the second part, the government sharing its rich data that it's collected on individuals and communities as one means of sharing its power. The availability now, as you heard from Peter, of large-scale digital systems and platforms, which has the potential to transform many aspects of the way in which governments and therefore the not-for-profit sectors operate. But that won't happen if government operations stay stuck in silos and resistant to the type of data that the not-for-profit sector needs. And New Zealand can teach us much here. We may hear more about that later on. The vision I see is of departments moving to systems-type thinking rather than being confined to organisational boundaries. Policy problems don't recognise boundaries. This forum is about cross-sector workings for complex problems, climate change, Indigenous quality of life, child abuse, just to name a few. So I want to now conclude by mentioning two issues I don't think were well covered in the papers, although may be behind their thinking. The first deals with the learning that can come out of the close relationships across sectors as the players together explore and experiment with what works. This is no time, unfortunately, to acquaint you with the work of Charles Sable and others, but suffice to say is that his and others' framework, called an experimentalist governance framework, emphasises several elements of great relevance to cross-jurisdictional and cross-sectoral working and learning. And I think that the points made in that framework were probably mostly covered in Peter's address today. But as part of this framework, the cooperation of civil society in adaptive policy solving, problem solving, is indispensable to success. And although accountability is built into the framework, it's about a cross-sector and peer learning from failures as well as successes. So it sounds very similar to the direction that Peter was taking us in. The second issue that I don't think had sufficient attention to date in anything written about these cross-sectoral relationships actually is about what I call the accountability deficit. When sectors work together on complex problems to achieve shared outcomes, it follows that special attention needs to be given to how shared accountabilities are to be managed. The ANAO, in its recent Public Sector Governance Better Practice Guide, recognises this and it asks, amongst other things, what says that a key success factor for cross-entity arrangements includes proper processes around management of shared risks and shared accountabilities. And it provides some guidance to practice from Canadian experience. The key tension we're talking about here is between traditional hierarchical accountabilities and those that arise horizontally from the blurring of sector boundaries. And that's particularly acute when the implementation change going from government to citizens is long, complex and, as Donald Kettle reminds us, often tangled. So we can raise several questions about how we manage the accountability issue in shared arrangements, and I won't go into the details. I will end on a few questions. For service providers, how do they manage accountabilities to citizens and to their often several funders? What does this mean for public servants? Are they compromising their accountability upwards when they respond flexibly and innovatively in attempting to meet citizens' needs? So I think we've got to the point where we need to understand mechanisms to be used to avoid the accountability deficit that comes when there is the cry, who is responsible here?
I think we've had some very good presentations and comments from Meredith highlighting a number of the reality issues that this vision that's being put to us need to face up to and work their way through. But we've now got 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So, anybody want to lead off?
My question really is for Tessa, and it responds a little bit to Peter Shergold's call this morning around consumer-driven care and those sorts of things, and how it marries up with a not-for-profit sector whose, as the Productivity Commission said, had spillover effects in terms of democracy, empowering citizens, contribution to good policy, a whole range of other benefits that are clearly, well, I would have thought, extremely difficult to be captured by citizens when they're working out where they're going to send payments in such a, for example, in an NDIS type situation. Does that actually spell the end for the incentives for not-for-profits to be engaged in that sort of thing, notwithstanding how important it is to the broader community?
I have two parts to the answer. One part is that I think we've developed a pretty strong and constructive language around choice, and the NDIS has been a vehicle for that conversation. But I don't think we've worked out how within that conversation we talk about ideas like minimum service levels, expectations or entitlements that we as a country think everyone needs to be able to access, and how you assert those kinds of entitlements or expectations into a consumer-based, a choice-based system like the NDIS. So for instance, there's been pretty active discussion about the kinds of choices that consumers might make, appropriately so, that are not the kinds of choices that services would make for them. But there still is space to say everyone needs to be able to access affordable housing, paid employment, an adequate income. And that's not necessarily, a consumer choice model doesn't necessarily provide all the answers to that. And I guess that's partly why I framed my presentation around the social safety net, that we need to find a way of marrying those, of bringing those two together, not at the exclusion of consumer choice, but also recognising that there is a role for civil society, and I think particularly for non-profit community services, in the provision of some of those basic and universal entitlements. How they do that with the communities that they work with and they serve is, I think, the perennial challenge. And so that brings me to the second part of my answer, which is I think we see that happen very differently across the sector. I've talked to non-profits and charities about the mission and the value statement and the connection with community in a bit the way I talked today, and I've had people come up afterwards and say, well, that's really nice to hear, but non-profit for us is just a business model. I think we need to recognise there are really different practices right across the non-profit sector. The kind of values that we're talking about in our civil society work are what we would like to see as enabling strong community leadership and participation in decision making and in meeting your own needs. But that's one part of a very broad sector, and there's lots of other practices in play that I think we need to also engage with around how that plays out.
Thanks. I'm Simon, CEO of Northside Community Service here in Canberra. I'm hesitating to say that I run a not-for-profit, and that's actually my question. We're talking about change, and it strikes me that what I think I'm running is a community business, and perhaps for Tessa or David, I'm wondering whether the language of not-for-profit is constraining us somewhat, given if I don't make a profit, I'm actually not being responsible, and I need some money to invest in social good, not give to shareholders. I don't think this is just a semantic point, but possibly indicates something about the future of the sector. Do we need to change the language?
I think the short answer is we need to educate what it is that not-for-profit's about. So most people in the room would be aware that not-for-profit means that the stakeholders, members, don't take a financial profit or a financial reward out of the organisation, but rather profit is reinvested. But at the same time, in an environment where philanthropy is growing and we're encouraging it, we need to get some education out there about how important it is that not-for-profit organisations are sustainable, that they are actually making a profit in order to reinvest and do all the things that we talk about them doing in a different environment to that which we have at the moment. And I think there's a number of words in the rhetoric that we really need to get definitions out there on. Choice is another one. We're just talking about choice under NDIS. Well, there is choice, but it's not the kind of choice that people would immediately attach to it. There's actually quite a restriction on what you can choose and how you can choose it and what kinds of things you can do. And I think that's where the rhetoric is really dangerous. We've got to get back to educating people on what it really means, whether it's not-for-profit or changing the title to something else. I think the fundamental thing is that we've got to get people understanding that our organisations have to be financially sustainable, they have to be mission sustainable in order to be able to deliver what we expect of them. And that's the accountability circle being closed, as Meredith just talked about. Well, then we start talking about how we account for that, how we account for our not-for-profit status and the opportunities that we get as a result of that. But I do think it's a really important issue, and why we've got rhetoric in the title of this seminar is because rhetoric is used a lot, but it's not actually defined. It's not actually, it's allowed to be used at a very top level where it means different things to different people. I think there's a few elements to my response to that. The first one is going back to, and again Meredith made the comment, I think it was Meredith, but also Tessa made the comment about bureaucracies, and the fact is individualised funding, person-centred care, choice, all of those things have an administrative component that goes with it. And so in order to facilitate that, we've got to recognise that, and again it comes back to educating people. But I think it also, there's also a very real need for a deeper conversation about what these things mean. In terms of risk shifting, from government to outside of government, I think the social impact bonds discussion and the experiments are a really good example of that. A social impact bond, amongst other things, should see risk being shifted to the investor. And I'm being very general, and I'm very happy to be abused as well. But government's not good at shifting risk, and I think we've seen that in PPPs around the country. We're seeing that in SIDS. We see it in a whole lot of areas, and lots of reasons for that. But I think the political diatribe is what drives it. And I kind of agree with Peter's last comments to or responses to one of the questions. I think we actually need to start respecting voters, and to the extent of saying, well, actually, if we explain things to voters and have a story around what it is we're doing and why we're undertaking that experiment or that thing or what's happened, then I think then they're going to be less punishing than just the very quick 6 second door jams that we have at the moment, which don't explain anything but allow people to go back to their corner and they're called leaves.
I suppose I think it's a terrific question, because if we had a breakout session to workshop a particular problem, I think that would be a good one to start with. From a community service perspective, one of the greatest risks that community service non-profits carry is the way government works with and funds them. So the idea that governments are holding the risk, I accept as a truism within government. That's very different from the experience that many of our members and colleagues have around the impact of funding. You know, the example David gave, that the way government funding processes require organisations to be insolvent puts us into significant breach of our government's responsibilities. Those are two absolutely true statements at the same time, and they reflect a history that I think many sector colleagues in the room could talk to. So I think that would be a terrific problem to really workshop around, first of all, what do we think we're saying when we're talking about risk? What are we talking about in the context of small organisations receiving small amounts of money to maintain really critical relationships in communities, large organisations running national networks with a whole different set of expectations, and then how do we work through that for the well-being of the communities that I think we all share an interest in and are most focused on in terms of the outcomes.
I might just jump in again. I've started talking now, I can't stop. The other aspect is exactly what Rich was talking about. So I think there's the political risk, and that drives these things, and then there's the risk that our organisations take within the sector. That's around sustainability, governance risk, mission risk. The ultimate risk, I think we often seem to forget, is the risk borne by the service recipients. And I think that's a really critical aspect of working up the risk and being able to make sure that the risk is in the right area to make sure that underlying, if you like, risk to recipients is dealt with properly as well.
My name's Shobha Vaki, and I'm Vice President of Prisoners Aid, and I'm also Vice Chair of the Canberra Interfaith Forum. I concur with Simon and David. We have the most fantastic services in the ACT. Nationally, we're very limited, but in the ACT, we have fabulous community services. We are a small territory, and we can work together, but still people fall through the cracks. In Prisoners Aid, I see people they finish their sentences, they have no homes, they have no work, they have no services after 12 months through care is finished, they're left out on the cold. I've talked to Yvette Berry, but she seems to think there's no problems with homelessness. I went for Homelessness Prevention Week. There are 2,000 people in Canberra sleeping outside at night. She claims that's a wrong statistic. There are 500 of them out of that 2,000 are below 18. I think it's a shame that we have people, even one person sleeping out in the cold in Canberra is no fun. I have 2 coats and I'm all right. And I have a car and I have a warm house. Other people don't have that. So what are we doing cross-sectorally? I mean, this is to cut the rhetoric, get to the point. So what are we doing about it? And I really feel passionately about people who have disabilities, who can't access the services.
I mean, I think you're right, and I think it's a really useful contribution to remember exactly what are the kinds of needs and issues that we're talking about. We're seeing rising poverty. We've maintained pretty well the institutions that protect us against inequality, but we're seeing a trend towards increasing inequality nationally, and it is a real challenge to maintain the institutions that protect us there. And that's at a very high level. Then we get to the very significant levels of need for hundreds of thousands of people across the country. So I think there's a lot that we could be doing better with the money that we're spending around social programs, around human services, and I think the way we collaborate with communities as well as community services is a critical part of that. But again, at the high level, I also think the data driver is a really important one for us to look at. So how are we tracking our progress? How are we measuring it? How are we, communities, able to access what government knows about that, to use that to test our own effectiveness as well as the effectiveness of government, and to really drive anti-poverty strategies, to really drive progress towards affordable housing, to really drive progress to addressing the very significant long-term unemployment that we're seeing right across the country.
Thank you very much. I think that did sort of put us back on the grounds of what are the real wicked problems that are very real that we need to be addressing in the background to this whole seminar. Can I just make a couple of comments, drawing a few threads from the presentations? A lot of this is about relationships, but the relationships require us to understand the different values of the different sectors and what came out in some of the questions, and the different values within some of those sectors. But you can't get a good relationship if you don't understand the frameworks within which the different groups are operating, and that's something that Jeff Mulgan's written about. We also need to understand, when we're thinking about this shift from MPM to this governance approach, that we need to think about how we balance competition and collaboration. When is there competition and when is there collaboration, and how do we get that right? These are really practical issues. Meredith picked up the issue of accountability. When you've got shared arrangements and networks, how do you manage that in a way that's going to be acceptable? I really was very interested in David's point that it's not just about how does the public service change, but what's the vision for the not-for-profit sector? What sort of implications are there for that, and how do we make sure that we're actually helping the sector to go through its structural changes? And we still keep on coming back to the problem of politics and government, and how do we have that process being willing to engage with risk, be experimental, and actually engage with the community on some of these very complex issues. But with that, let's finish this session, and I think we've got morning tea. Is that right, John?
Yes, morning tea starts now.
Government's not good at shifting risk, and I think we've seen that in PPPs around the country. We've seen that in SIBs. We see it in a whole lot of areas. Lots of reasons for that, but I think the political diatribe is what drives it. And I kind of agree with Peter's last comments to or responses to one of the questions. I think we actually need to start respecting voters, and to the extent of saying, well, actually, if we explain things to voters and have a story around what it is we're doing and why we're undertaking that experiment or that thing or what's happened, then I think then they're going to be less punishing than just the very quick 6-second door jams that we have at the moment, and, which don't explain anything but allow people to go back to their corner and their core beliefs.
Yes.
I suppose I think it's a terrific question, because if we had a breakout session to workshop a particular problem, I think that would be a good one to start with. From a community service perspective, one of the greatest risks that community service non-profits carry is the way government works with and funds them. So the idea that governments are holding the risk, I accept as a truism within government, that's very different from the experience that many of our members and colleagues have around the impact of funding. You know, the example David gave, that the way government funding processes require organisations to be insolvent puts us into significant breach in our government's responsibilities. Those are two absolutely true statements at the same time, and they reflect a history that I think many sector colleagues in the room could talk to. So I think that would be a terrific problem to really workshop around, first of all, what do we think we're saying when we're talking about risk? What are we talking about in the context of small organisations receiving small amounts of money to maintain really critical relationships in communities, large organisations running national networks with a whole different set of expectations, and then how do we work through that for the wellbeing of the communities that I think we all share an interest in and are most focused on in terms of the outcomes.
I might just jump in again. I've started talking now, I can't stop. The other aspect is exactly what Rich was talking about. So I think there's the political risk, and that drives these things. And then there's the risk that our organisations take within the sector. That's around sustainability, governance risk, mission risk. The ultimate risk, I think we often seem to forget, is the risk borne by the service recipients. And I think that's a really critical aspect of working up the risk and being able to make sure that the risk is in the right area to make sure that underlying, if you like, risk to recipients is dealt with properly as well.